Okay, so I know what the title says, and I just couldn't find a better way to classify all these other decks. If you haven't seen my meta tier list, I posted it a few weeks ago. I only included the decks that had new support from Supreme Darkness or had just come out of Supreme Darkness, plus the Blue Eye stuff. So in this video, I want to go over other decks that I think are worth talking about in the current format. Anyways, I want to quickly go over some of the tiers in this video because they are different from the other ones. The first one is Solid Meta Contender. I think that decks in this tier have a solid chance of being able to do well at a tournament when you're expecting to play like a bunch of the top decks like Ryzeal, Maliss, and Blue Eyes. I personally think that those are the best decks in the format, and most, if not all, of these decks are at least a little bit weaker than those, but that's not to say that these decks can't compete with them, and I think the decks in this tier would be able to put up a pretty good fight against them. Potential Meta Contender, the next tier, I think that these decks are still somewhat competitive, but maybe have like one or two problems, or the format is shaping up in a way that puts them at a disadvantage or something like that. So decks that maybe could do well, but it probably requires a little bit of luck or a really good pilot on the deck. And then Solid Rogue Contender, I think these are just like the decent like rogue decks that are still playable in the format, but obviously they're just better ones out there. And then finally, Weak Rogue Contender, I think that these decks just aren't super great in this format and probably just aren't worth considering at all. With all that being said, let's hop straight into the tier list, starting off with Labrynth. I think that Labrynth, although it's definitely seeing a lot less play now, I think it's something that could still have some potential to compete in the metagame. Labrynth as a strategy is different enough to where there generally isn't going to be too much in the format that specifically hurts it, because no one's really preparing for like a back row deck for the most part, since the tier 1 decks all don't really play any back row. That being said though, there is some overlap in some of the hate that people are playing for top decks, like Bystials especially, and Bystials can be really annoying for the furniture version of the deck. So I personally think that if Labrynth were to be a viable deck, the most viable version would probably be like the quote-unquote trap version with 3 or 4 of the big ladies and none of like the little furniture monsters, because I think those just lose out to the Bystials too hard. Even with like the trap build, I think that it is going to just be at a bit of a disadvantage, since back row generally doesn't do too well into a deck like Ryzeal, since as soon as you activate a card, they can use Detonator, pop something else, and force you to activate it then, if it's even chainable. So this deck probably will have some problems into Ryzeal. Maybe the Maliss will have a little bit of a better matchup, since Maliss doesn't necessarily deal that well with back row. I think that it's going to have some of the same inherent flaws that Trap decks has always had, and for that reason I'm going to put it in potential meta contender. Next up is Tenpai, and there are a few different ways to play Tenpai. Like, you could still play just like the pure going second OTK version, or you could play more of like the Fiendsmith version and treat it more like a going first engine, where you just generate bodies for cards like Seals in the Fiendsmith engine. And I think both decks are still semi-viable. I'll say the Fiendsmith version of the deck is probably a little better, and I put it in like potential meta contender. And then I'd probably put just like pure Tenpai going second as like a solid rogue contender. There isn't too much to talk about in terms of the pure OTK version. The deck just has like pretty low consistency. Once you burn through your one-ups, there isn't really too much you can do in terms of that afterwards. And just playing it a going second deck in a format where the decks that go first are just kind of crazy is just not something that I feel like is very advantageous this current format. That being said though, in the Fiendsmith version, I think having the tools to go second is nice with the Tenpai engine. If you get into simplified game states, I think the Tenpai engine can really shine, and in those cases I feel like that deck could be okay, so that's why I put it in potential meta contender. It's probably a fine deck overall, but I don't think it's anything too crazy. Next up is Melodious. I think that this is a pretty popular budget deck, but outside of that, I think as a deck itself, it is also not terrible. It's able to play a fair number of non-engine, like 18 to even 21 at times, and I think that going first its end board is actually not too bad as well. It's able to summon like a triple DD Crow, which can be pretty good against the graveyard decks like Blue Eyes and Fiendsmith variants, and also its end board is just kind of really annoying to deal with for some decks outside of Maliss when they have an Aria on the board. It does have somewhat of a problematic Maliss matchup. It's not unwinnable by any means, but I feel like Maliss is probably still favored into this deck, and I think for that reason I can't really put it at like solid meta contender. It probably is on the same level as some of these other decks out here. It's definitely a pretty decent deck, and it has tools to be able to beat all the top decks. Its end board will have to be adjusted quite a bit in order to beat Maliss, makes it so I don't think it's something that I would consider super solid, but it's still playable. Next up is Yubel, and I feel like Yubel is one of the first decks I'll put in solid meta contender. I still think that Yubel is a pretty scary deck. Yes, there are a bunch of hand traps running around, and yes, there are Bystials running around, but I feel like Yubel is a deck that is able to play through hand traps like fairly decently, and now with the board breakers that people are playing, like things like Metaltronus for example, generally aren't as high impact against Yubel as they are against something like Maliss or Ryzeal for example. People's decks right now are just not really built for Yubel, and I think for that reason Yubel might have a chance to shine. That's not to say Yubel isn't without his problems. I still think it's definitely a tier like lower than Ryzeal and Maliss, but I feel like this is still a pretty scary deck, and it's probably the first one I would consider an actual pretty solid threat in the metagame right now. Next up is Plants. I think Plants is just like a weaker combo deck than something like Maliss. Of course, its end boards are pretty scary, but I feel like this deck is a deck that just has too much engine. Doesn't usually have enough space to play that on engine, and I think that's probably the biggest factor that holds it back. Not a terrible deck by any means. It's just like another combo deck where cool, you're able to play through a bunch of hand traps, you're not really affected by Bystials that everyone's playing, and you can set up like a board that can't really be broken, but going second is a problem for the deck, so I think that's why I'll put it in rogue contender. Next up is Purrely, and Purrely is interesting to me. I think the concept of the deck itself is pretty abysmal into a card like Detonator. You can't really do anything with like the level 1 Purrelys unless you have a way to deal with Detonator every time, because as soon as you use the effect, the Detonator can just chain and pop it, and then you won't be able to XD summon. Continuous spells like My Friend Purrely just don't really work. Having your engine pretty much be unplayable when you don't have an out to Detonator is pretty problematic for the deck, so I probably just have to put it in like okay rogue. I'm tempted to put it in like weak, but outside of Detonator, the deck is fine, I suppose. It's nothing too crazy or anything to write home about, but like I mentioned, the biggest thing holding it back is just its problem dealing with Ryzeal Detonator. However, if the deck always does it out to Detonator, I suppose it's okay, but you can say that about quite a few other decks. Next up is Goblin Biker, and I think Goblin Biker, the sole thing that's like propping it up in potential meta contender is the fact that it actually does fairly decently into Ryzeal. Its main engine does have ways to out the Detonator, and its engine I guess just sort of plays really well into a deck like Ryzeal because they can take advantage of the fact that your opponent has XD monsters. I think outside of that fact though, they're probably just like a fine rogue mid-range-ish deck. If it wasn't for Ryzeal in the format, I'd probably say it's just like a meh rogue deck, but I think the one thing it does have going for it is that it just happens to have a particularly decent Ryzeal matchup, and with Ryzeal running around so much in the format, I think that Goblin Bikers are actually fairly decently positioned right now. Next up is Vanquish Soul. I think that Vanquish Soul is just like a decent rogue deck as well. It is a deck that can play fairly well into some non-engine, I'll give it that. It isn't a deck that typically loses to just like a single piece of non-engine that people are playing right now. It isn't super affected by the Bystials. It does technically have ways to dodge effects like Imperm as well with just inherently in an engine, and it can play a fairly decent resource game overall. But I feel like this deck just doesn't really stand out in terms of the amount of power it can have, and I think for that reason it just probably goes in rogue contender. Like, it's probably playable, but other decks just have a much higher ceiling and even sometimes a higher floor, so I feel like Vanquish Soul just can't really go higher than like a decent rogue deck. Next up is Fire King, and Fire King is interesting because it did win YCS Birmingham, but I think one of the biggest, if not the biggest reason that it won was because the player that won with it was a very skilled pilot and made a good meta call for that specific event. And of course, generally just not being super affected by common non-engine like Fuelos and things like Bystials is pretty nice for the deck. I want to say it's like almost a solid meta contender, but I feel like for the average player playing this deck, they probably aren't going to be able to play it at a high enough level to be able to consistently compete with the top decks. So I think for now, I'll just put it as a pretty solid potential meta contender. Like, I think Dinkabui made a pretty good meta call overall, and recognize that the format is in a place where like this deck can kind of shine because destruction based effects are not super great against this deck, and like I said, the common non-engine, the format just doesn't overlap too much into it. So I think Fire King does have some potential to be good in this current format. Next up is Centur-ion, and Centur-ion I think is like I want to say weak rogue contender. This deck just gets absolutely destroyed by Detonator. I don't really think this deck has great ways around it. Like, yes, it can play a bunch of non-engine, but I think it falls into like a similar category as Purrely. Like, going first, it's fine. It can definitely win when going first against other decks, but you can say that about pretty much all these decks on the list, so I don't feel like Centur-ion has anything crazy going for it. And going second, it suffers a similar problem as Purrely. Like, I don't think they're going to be able to get their engine going at all into a card like Detonator. Now, I will give Centur-ion a bit of credit. It is still pretty good into hand traps like Fuelos, Shifter, Bystials, like things that are pretty common in this format, so it probably won't lose too hard to hand traps, but its engine just is pretty much outclassed by like the top tier decks engines. So I think overall it's probably like a fine rogue deck and you probably still get away with playing it, but I think this is probably not the right format for this to do super well. Next up is Chimera, and I think Chimera is also a kind of scary deck when it is able to go off. I think it does have a few weaknesses to certain key hand traps in this current format. Like, I feel like it is going to struggle a little bit into Fulos because its ceiling is going to be capped by a lot. Of course, going second, it isn't a deck that's able to play like the most number of non-engine, so I think it'll kind of fall into like a similar boat as Plants. Like, I would say these two decks like Chimera and Plants are probably just a little bit better than the other decks in the Solid Rogue Contender, but I feel like they're not quite at the level of some of these decks up here. So Chimera as a deck is probably a pretty good rogue deck. It's probably one of the better rogue decks out there, but if you want to play like an unfair combo deck, I feel like there's just better ones out there than Chimera right now. Next up are Sharks. I think Sharks are like in a fine place right now. One thing Sharks have going for it is that you probably can get away with like trying to play a few Ryzeal cards in there, and that can strengthen the Shark engine as a whole, making it a little bit more consistent and giving it more extenders to help them play through interactions. Going first, this deck has no problem putting up like pretty good boards, and I will say, like, I don't think that's a problem for any of the decks on this list. Like, if they can go first, most of these decks, if not all of them, I think can pretty confidently beat decks like Ryzeal and Maliss, but I'm more evaluating them based on how they would fare like going second, and I'm trying to take a look at how good they are into commonly played cards in the metagame like hand traps and such. So I think Sharks is probably just going to go into the Solid Rogue Contender as well. I think it's a pretty decent rogue deck. Once again, I don't think it does anything too special, but it just seems like a watered down version of Ryzeal, if you catch my drift. Next up is Millenium. I think this is probably the first deck I'm going to put in weak rogue contender. I don't think this deck is very good. Like, it's a very like simple deck, and whether you choose to go first or second with it, I feel like it's just not good enough in both cases. Even if you do your quote-unquote like full combo, the deck is pretty limited in terms of what it can do, because summoning their main monster requires you to like shuffle everything else that isn't like a Millenium back into the deck. So it's not like you can establish like a big board and then slap like a spell trap negate on top of it. So going first, I don't think it's going to be super great, and going second, if you're just trying to like OTK your opponent, it's going to have the same problems as Tenpai Dragon. Like, I don't think you want to be going second in this current format unless you're forced to, and a deck that specifically tries to go second, I think, is going to run into a bunch of problems with how strong end boards are right now. I'm not saying this deck is like terrible and unplayable, but I do think it's just a step below all these other decks in the tier above it. I guess speaking of tier, I also think tier is like really poorly positioned right now, with all the Bystials running around especially, not to mention the fact that this deck can't really play any non-engine. Like, I think this deck just is going to get absolutely smoked in this current format. Like, there just isn't a good matchup for this deck, in my opinion, no matter what you play against, like whether it be Ryzeal, Maliss, or Blue Eyes. Like, they all have cards that are almost like they're specifically designed to beat Tearlament in some sense, so I don't think this deck is worth even talking about in this current format. Next up is Red Dragon Archfiend. I think that Red Dragon Archfiend is a deck that it has some solid potential as a combo deck. I'd probably say it's on a similar level as Chimera and Plants. It has like similar strengths to where going first, it is fairly resilient to some hand traps. It is going to kind of get caught in the crossfire with cards like Fulos. As far as I know, like the Bystials are okay against this deck as well. In general, like it just falls into the same boat as these two. Solid when going first, has some problems when going second, and is kind of caught in the crossfire a little bit. So I don't think it can really go anything higher than Solid Rogue Contender. Next up is Voiceless. I don't want to say it's like a rogue deck, but I don't think it's like super great either. I'd probably put it at the bottom of a potential meta contender. I'd say maybe it's a little bit better than these rogue decks because it isn't going to lose to most hand traps, but the Bystials are fairly impactful against this deck especially. Voiceless players will have, I guess, fewer ways to get access to low because now they have to be wary of all the Bystials running around. So I think that could be a problem for the deck. But outside of that, this deck is still very resilient against hand traps and can play a good number of non-engine. So I think in general, it's probably okay. I wouldn't say it's like a great deck by any means, but I feel like it's at least like maybe a little bit better than Rogue. Next up is Dinomorphia, and I think Dinomorphia is kind of similar to Labrynth. It does have the same problems like a trap deck would, but Dinomorphia, I guess, has something going for it in the sense that they are able to have like an in-engine floodgate in terms of like Rexstrom and stuff, and that can be pretty annoying for a lot of decks to deal with. But I think unlike Labrynth, it also has like a few additional weaknesses, because when you're introducing monsters into the mix, then your opponent's engine starts to become a bit better against you, if that makes any sense. Like if you think about what Labrynth is doing, like its game plan is fairly simple. It's like set some trap cards, summon out the big ladies, and then kind of control the pace of the game from there. But Dinomorphia actually requires like some of its main deck monsters like the Ryzeal to get its engine going. I think that just opens up Dinomorphia to losing out to more interactions from your opponent and non-engine as well. So I think it probably is a step below Labrynth, but it is like a solid rogue deck, and it's still a pretty scary deck if you do run into it, because I don't think many decks are packing like good answers to the Dinomorphia boss monsters. So I think in general it's probably a pretty decent rogue deck. Next up is Mimighoul. I'd say Mimighoul is like not weak by any means. I also don't think it's like super great at the moment. I don't think it does anything like super well, aside from the fact that maybe it doesn't lose super hard to common hand traps like Bystials, Shifter, and Foolos. You can play like a slower control game, blocking them out with like your dungeon and making it so they can't normal summon. But decks like Ryzeal do have an in-engine out to that by just either special summoning a bunch from the hand or using like X to send Aggregator. Aggregator can negate the dungeon. So I think that Mimighoul is probably just a fine rogue deck. It's probably one of the weaker ones right now, but I think it's at least better than the ones down here. Next up is Heroes. Heroes is like a bottom of potential meta contender. The deck, of course, does have the same problems as like some of these decks here, where it can't play a super high number of non-engine. But I will give Heroes a bit of credit. I feel like their engine at least feels a little bit better playing against like some of the end boards than some of these other engines do. So I will say it does maybe have a little bit of an edge there. That being said though, it is going to get caught in the crossfire with cards like Foolos and Bystials in this format. So I don't think it's like a super well positioned deck right now, but I will at least give it some credit and say that its engine is actually kind of scary and is able to do quite a lot on its own, even against a established board. Next up is Ritual Beast. I don't think Ritual Beast is super great right now. It loses to like the same cards that Maliss does. It's going to get hit with Lancia a lot as well, since everyone's playing that for Maliss. It might even get hit with Chaos Hunter, since some people are playing that now as well. This deck does have a fairly hard time against those cards. I don't want to say it's like weak by any means, because at least this deck is able to play cards like Shifter. It's not affected by Bystials. Like, it does have the potential to set up like a nasty Floodgate in Protos, so I will give it at least a little bit of credit. But I think in general, Ritual Beast is just not a very good deck at the moment, and it probably won't ever be until Maliss is kind of out of the format. Next up is Sky Striker, and I think that Sky Striker is similar to Tenpai. It just feels like almost a weaker version of Tenpai, so I probably put it in like the middle of rogue contender. It can go first and try to play more of a control game, but I think, unfortunately, it is just going to get blown out by a bunch of these other decks whose engine can just push through their few copies of Widow Anchor, Shark Hand, and stuff like that. But I will give it like a little bit of credit. I think there are enough tools in the format to allow a going second deck like Sky Striker to take advantage of, to maybe have somewhat of a chance against these decks even when they go second. It's not like every single board breaker out there is completely unplayable. I don't think there's too much to say about this deck in general. It feels like a worse version of Tenpai almost, but at least it does have some tools that a going second deck like Millenium wouldn't have access to. But if you were to choose a rogue deck, I would say it's at least on like a somewhat similar level as some of these decks in this tier. Next up is Branded. I think that Branded is something that has like some potential to this format. I'd probably put it at, like at the bottom with like Voiceless Voice as well. I feel like it has a similar issue as Voiceless. Like, it can be pretty decent when it's able to set up its board going first, but it does suffer a little bit because people are playing a lot of Bystials right now, and Bystials are fairly good against Branded just like they are against Voiceless Voice. But even despite that, I think Branded is still strong enough to compete in this current format. They are still able to give you like a Floodgate type monster, and that can be pretty annoying for you to deal with. I think that this can't really go any higher than potential meta contender, and even then it might be a little bit generous to Branded, considering it really does suffer a lot from having all these Bystials in the format and decks like Maliss that can just banish stuff out of their graveyard. I will give them a little bit of credit though. I think that Ryzeal Detonator isn't always the greatest against them and won't always have the highest impact against them. Next up is Rescue Ace. I think that Rescue Ace is pretty much on the same level as a deck like Vanquish Soul. They're just decks with higher ceilings and higher floors out there, and I don't really see why you choose to play a deck like Rescue Ace when you could play some of these other decks out here. But I guess to Rescue Ace's credit, I guess it has similar strengths as Fire King in the sense that it isn't going to lose to commonly played cards in this metagame. But unlike Fire King, I think that Ryzeal Detonator is like pretty decent against Rescue Ace in general. So I feel like overall Rescue Ace probably just can't really go higher than Solid Rogue Contender. Next up is Memento. I think Memento is also another deck I'll put up there in Solid Meta Contender. This is a pretty scary combo deck whose engine is fairly strong. I think it's fairly okay going second even into a card like Detonator or into like a half Maliss end board if they're able to hand trap them along the way. Similar to Yubel, it is a very strong going first combo deck, and it is a deck that's very good at playing through non-engine. But also, like Yubel, I think it's still obviously worse than something like Maliss and Ryzeal, but it definitely gets closer to their power level than compared to some of these other decks down here. Next up is Drytron, and I think Drytron is also probably going to have to go in weak Rogue Contender right now. This deck doesn't do super well into a lot of the commonly played hand traps right now, and it doesn't really have anything going for it in terms of being able to play well into a deck like Ryzeal or a deck like Maliss as well. I don't think it has any particularly redeeming qualities, at least in the current format, so I probably just have to put it in weak Rogue Contender. Just loses too much to the non-engine out there. Even combo decks in the Solid Rogue Contender tier are probably just better than this, at least in the current format. And then finally, Runick. I want to say Runick's not even good this format, but I will put it in Rogue Contender because at least as a Runick Stun deck, there's always going to be floodgates that are like good against the meta game, and when they go first, they are probably going to win the game most of the time. But Runick also has, I feel like, a pretty big weakness against a deck like Ryzeal, for example. You can't really like set 5 when going second and have it be good like it was like in a previous format. Maybe it's gonna suffer against Detonator, similar to decks like Labrynth and Dinomorphia. So overall, I think has same problems as the other trap decks, and also doesn't really do anything better than the Dinomorphia deck or Labrynth deck in terms of stunning out your opponent. So I'm just put it in Solid Rogue Contender, but to its credit, it's not going to lose to any commonly played cards in this current format, most likely. And when it goes first, there's probably a floodgate that can play that beats every single deck out there. So for that reason, it probably just goes at the bottom of Solid Rogue, in my opinion. So that's going to do it for this video. Let me know what you guys thought about in the comment section below. Keep in mind, this is just my opinion only. Let me know in the comments if you agree or disagree. Also, keep in mind, I can't possibly cover every single deck that's semi-playable. So if you don't see your favorite deck on here, I'm sorry. I can't possibly cover every single deck on one of these tier lists. But to close it all out, I think in general, my thoughts are if the deck is able to dodge some of the commonly played cards in the format, like Fulos and Bystial. So for example, a deck like Fire King can do that, and is able to have at least some way to play through like a half Maliss end board and does okay into a Ryzeal. I think those are kind of like the criteria I have in my mind for the deck to at least be a potential meta contender. Other than that, I think for the most part, whatever deck that you're thinking of that isn't like a top tier deck right now probably will just be Rogue or below, in my opinion, because I think those 3 things I mentioned are just too big of a hurdle for most decks to overcome if you're trying to do well at a big tournament. With all that being said though, obviously you can play whatever deck you want if you're just going to a locals, and it'll probably do fine. But with all that being said, I hope you guys enjoyed the video, and I will see you guys in the next one. Take care.